COVID-19 has claimed 792 lives in South Africa so far. Now, many have raised questions about how a COVID-19 death is identified. How is a decision reached on whether a person's cause of death is COVID-19 or whether they merely died with the virus in their system? Or to discuss this, we're joined now by Wits University's Director of the MRC Respiratory and Meningeal Pathogens Research Unit, Professor Shabir Mahdi. Good evening, Professor. Always wonderful to talk to you, and I'm really hoping you can give us some answers this evening. I've spoken to Dr. Keith Klutter, Head of Health in the Western Cape. We've spoken about 4 of the deaths of children 18 and under. One was a premature baby of 2 days. Another was a 2-year-old with serious comorbidities. And then of the 2 teens, one had a very rare disease that they were very sick from, and the other child was in a car accident, which is what led to their demise. What I don't understand is why those deaths are recorded as COVID-19 deaths when it seems that COVID didn't lead to the demise. They merely died with the virus in their system. Could you explain this to us, please?
Yeah, so good evening, Sally. So, Sally, you raise an important point. So there's a very standardized manner in which you need to complete cause of death form. And there needs to be a biological association between the reason why the child died and perhaps what you've identified. So as you correctly pointed out, the mere presence of the virus doesn't necessarily infer that that person died because of the virus. So the 2-day-old child, as an example, was the child that was born prematurely. And the reason why the child died was the child had very immature lung, and the child couldn't actually oxygenate adequately. The child was born to a mother that was positive for COVID, and the mother probably transmitted the virus to the child. But the cause of death in that child was basically what we call hyaline membrane disease. The finding of the virus in that child was purely coincidental and wasn't, so that particular case, as an example, shouldn't be attributed to COVID-19. So there needs to be a biological association in terms of the presence of whatever virus or bacteria you're identifying and the clinical presentation of the particular child, of the particular case. The absolute manner in which to make a definitive diagnosis as to whether a case is due to COVID or not is to do what we call post-mortem biopsies or post-mortem. Unfortunately, that is rarely done in South Africa. So often we need to use our clinical judgment in terms of whether there is a biological association between the clinical illness that the person dies from and the presence of the virus.
Can I jump in there? If doctors have to use their clinical judgment, and I know that sometimes, as you say, they've picked up that the virus is in the system, why would a child who's dying from a car accident then get onto the COVID list? It doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, I'm thinking of an extreme example, but George Floyd, who was killed because a policeman put his knee to his neck for nearly 9 minutes, was COVID-19 positive. His cause of death is certainly not COVID-19, but suffocation. Aren't we getting it wrong? And is this a worldwide standard? Should we be re-looking at how we're classifying COVID deaths?
Well, there are standardized criteria that you use. And the example that you cite of a child that died of a motor vehicle accident and for some reason the child was tested, that cause of death is not COVID-19. The cause of death in that child is motor vehicle accident. And the WHO has got clear guidelines in terms of how to attribute cause of death, not just from COVID-19. So as another example, someone with HIV that dies from tuberculosis, the underlying cause of death in that individual is HIV, but the immediate cause might be tuberculosis. But someone with HIV that dies from a motor vehicle accident, the underlying cause of death in that individual is a motor vehicle accident. So it's an example. So you really need to interpret the data. You need to interpret the case in the context of everything else for that particular individual.
Prof, I'm going to jump in here again. Doesn't that mean that, in fact, we've got, I think it's 792 deaths? Shouldn't it actually be at least dropped to 790? I mean, shouldn't this be changed?
Yeah. Well, it should be. But again, I think we should stop. We should avoid getting fixated with these numbers. So even the 798 deaths.
I tell you why it's important. My concern with this is that we're looking at 4, and in fact, I think there's a 5th child under 18 that is now on that list when we get the daily stats as having died linked to COVID-19. Parents are looking to send their children back to school next week. Parents looking at those stats go, hell no, I'm not sending my child back. But if we look carefully into the stats, those children didn't die of COVID-19. So for me, it's not about a fixation. It's a crucial issue of fact.
You're completely correct. It is very misleading to indicate that 5 children have died from COVID-19 when it's really only 2. And even those 2 cases that died were children with comorbidities. So there are risk factors as to why they develop severe disease, which is not what occurs in the average child under the age of 18. They rarely would develop severe disease, let alone die. So you are completely correct. It's not 5 children that have died from COVID-19. It's 2 children that have possibly died. The other 3, the finding of the virus in those children is purely coincidental. And that speaks to our knowledge that we know that even in adults, between 50 to 80% of people that are infected with the virus will be completely asymptomatic. So, as you mentioned, the case in the US, the person, they found the virus in that individual, but the cause of death in that individual was asphyxiation and not COVID-19. So the presence of the virus on its own is insufficient proof to indicate that that person has actually died from that viral infection.
So 2 questions in one. Is it going to change, particularly around the way we classify child deaths from COVID? And surely it's important to actually really get this right, because there must be legal and life policy implications on what appears on your cause of death, on your death certificate.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And there's an urgent need for adequate training of healthcare personnel in terms of how to complete those cause of death certificates. Because, like I said, there are clear guidelines, and the type of examples that you cited are exactly what should be avoided when completing those cause of death. Ideally, what should happen is that all of these deaths, especially the unusual ones, they should be sort of arbitrated by a group of doctors to come to some sort of association as to whether the death was actually due to the presence of the virus or whether there was some other biological explanation as to why that individual died.
Prof, you're part of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't this something you can take forward and should take forward?
Well, there are actually guidelines that have actually been proposed. In fact, those guidelines were developed by the Medical Research Council in South Africa in terms of how people should go about attributing cause of death. So those are actually available in the public domain. And I would strongly urge healthcare workers to actually access that from the Medical Research Council website, which gives clear guidelines in terms of how COVID deaths should be attributed.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your insights this evening and your frankness in discussing COVID-19 deaths with us. Thank you very much. That was Professor Shabir Mahdi. He's a vaccinologist, and of course, he's from Wits University.